and you can resolve significant audit findings and hopefully do so without a huge return of money. And so this was a process that was generally accepted at the U.S. Department of Ed. As I mentioned, agriculture, HHS, DOL, we would try cooperative audit resolution tactics with those agencies, and they weren't interested. Well, now it's a mandatory process that you have to at least attempt cooperative audit resolution to resolve significant audit findings. So that's really good news for potential auditees, right, that you can hopefully resolve issues that do come up, which hopefully no issues do, right, because that's why we're here this afternoon. But if issues do come up in your audit, well, then hopefully you can work out a cooperative resolution process. Another new definition to highlight, and this is one that I think you can be excited for, is this new category of procurement called micro-purchasing. So our procurement rules have changed completely for our post-secondary folks. They will be very, very similar for our secondary folks in the room. They look very similar to what you currently have. Post-secondary folks, you've never even seen the sole sourcing language. You've not seen the language on competitive versus non-competitive bids, right? All of it's going to be fairly new for our post-secondary subgrantees. What's new for everyone is this idea on micro purchases, which are purchases under $3,000 that don't require a competitive process. So you can go out and purchase something under $3,000 without obtaining quotes, without going through some level of competitive process. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to procurement. Questions on the definitions? I do hope that if I am going too fast or if you do have questions that come up, that you stop me at any time. It makes it a lot more interesting for everyone in the room if you guys can interrupt me from talking every so often. Conflict of interest, here's a new provision as it goes to that theme on accountability and oversight. And you see the new language says that all non-federal entities have to establish conflict of interest policies, which is not terribly new. Hopefully your organization has a conflict of interest policy. They were expected of you previously. But what's interesting here is that you have to disclose potential conflicts. And what is a potential conflict? We've yet to see. That the U.S. Department of Ed will have to define that for us. But it is something to highlight and note that this new policy includes potential conflicts. In addition, there's a new provision on mandatory disclosures, which again are going to, this is a new requirement placed on grantees and subgrantees that you disclose any violation of federal criminal law, bribery, gratuity violations that could potentially affect the federal award, right? So this means, or does this mean, if your Perkins program director is out at a bar and he sees his buddy who happens to be one of his vendors, but they're friends and they're talking, and he says, you know what, I have this side business, totally unrelated. I'd love for you to get in on the ground floor. You can invest in my side business. You know, what do you think? Is that what do you think? Can he invest in his vendor's side business, totally unrelated to Perkins, right? I don't know. I don't know. Is that a potential conflict of interest? Is that a gratuity violation? Could it potentially affect my federal award and my, you know, awarding of contracts in the future if I become now a business, you know, even though they already have the contract, well, if I'm now invested in his other business, well, how will that impact? Right, and it's not really clearly defined. It's just that you should be cautious that there are these mandatory disclosures, that you have to think broadly, and then it's not just actual conflicts or actual bribery or gratuity violations, but it's anything that's potential as well. So there are three primary systems that every grantee and subgrantee must have in place in order to manage and operate a federal education grant program. Who knows the three systems? First one is the financial management system. Second is equipment, and then third is procurement. These three systems were previously discussed in the administrative regulation requirements. So for our current award funds, the old rules that exist that are applicable for our current award funds, that means Part 74 of EDGAR for post-secondary folks, and Part 80 of EDGAR for my secondary folks. So the administrative systems, the administrative regulations are in Part 74 of EDGAR, old EDGAR, for post-secondary, and Part 80 for my secondary. And that's where you're going to find the requirements on financial management, equipment, and procurement. As I said, the Omni Circular has revised these requirements. They've streamlined them, one set of rules, and we'll talk about those rules and how they differ from what was previously required. We're going to spend a lot of time in financial management controls, and that's because that's the first place that an auditor comes in and looks, right? They want to see your finances, your financial management controls. That's where you have potential liability and exposure, so that's where we want to concentrate. I mentioned potential exposure. There are 4 different ways you can have findings, right? 4 different types of oversight entities that could issue findings against you. And the first is the Office of Inspector General Audit, which is a branch of the U.S. Department of Ed, right? They have their own audit team, and OIG comes in. They would come in, if they're doing a Perkins review, they're going to start at the state, because the state is their grantee. And then they are going to select a handful of subgrantees and also look at the subgrantees. At the end of the day, the state is responsible for all of the spending of its subgrantees. That's why the state is, exercises a lot of oversight on your expenditures and on your budgets. And it's because at the end of the day, if there's an audit finding or a monitoring finding, it goes against the state. They are the initial grantee. Now, then the state can turn around and then recover that from you as a subgrantee if it's your violation, but the initial line is always going to be between the feds and the state. Single audits is another way that you can have liability or potential exposure. Every year, if you expend a certain amount of federal funds, you have a single audit conducted. Depending on how much Perkins funding you get, it might be considered a major program that's part of that single audit process. There's also program monitoring. Federal program monitoring comes in from the feds. New Mexico is slated for federal program monitoring, I believe, in September, so coming up. And then pass-through monitoring, that's the state monitoring its subgrantees. And that's a requirement in the regulations. The state has to monitor its subgrantees. It's not that they are trying to make your lives miserable, it's that they're actually required to do so by the federal regulations. So those are your 4 different types of oversight that could identify issues and potential liability with your financial management system. So let's look at the current rule, or old rule, current old, I guess, and then what will be applicable come July 1, 2015. I've used 80-20, that's for our secondary folks, instead of Part 74, but they're all very similar, and really the changes are not significant here. You have to have financial reporting, accounting records, internal controls, budget control. You have to make sure that your expenditures are allowable, source documentation, cash management. All of these rules are outlined as part of your financial management system, right? The new rules pretty much keep the same list. They added identification of awards, and then they combined accounting records with source documentation. Otherwise, though, same list of requirements. So it's changed, but not significantly changed. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to go over with our financial management system is